I still remember the exact moment I stumbled upon the truth. It was a quiet, unassuming evening, one of those nights when everything feels perfectly in place. I'd come home a little earlier than usual, anticipating a calm dinner with Amanda, the woman I'd trusted with my whole life. As I stepped into our bedroom, I noticed her phone lying carelessly on the nightstand. I'd seen it there before, a small, unremarkable object that somehow held the promise of connection. But that night, it became the vessel for a revelation that would shatter every illusion I had ever clung to. The screen was on, and an unread message caught my eye. "I still taste you. When are you going to slip away again?" My heart froze mid-beat. At first, I wondered if it were some sort of misplaced text, a message meant for someone else, perhaps a joke or a momentary lapse in judgment. But something in the tone, in the way those words slithered across the screen, made it clear that this wasn't a harmless slip of the finger. With trembling hands, I unlocked the phone and began to scroll through what I initially assumed was a fleeting conversation. What I found instead was a labyrinth of betrayal. 1,000 messages, each one a cruel testament to a secret life I never knew Amanda was living. The affair had been ongoing for over a year and a half. Each notification was like a dagger, meticulously carving away at the foundation of trust we had built over decades. I read lines dripping with disdain, lines where she mocked me for my naivety and reveled in her newfound freedom. In one message, she even sneered that I was too clueless to ever suspect a thing, as if my ignorance were a punchline to her private joke. My mind raced. I felt a dizzying mix of betrayal, humiliation, and a seething anger that I couldn't quite contain. I sat there on the edge of our unmade bed, the phone in my hand feeling heavier than ever. Every word I read deepened the wound, and yet, amidst the swirling chaos of my thoughts, a curious clarity began to emerge. I realized that everything I thought I knew about us was a carefully constructed facade, one that had masked a reality too painful to imagine. Just then, the sound of water splashing and the soft shuffle of feet echoed from the bathroom. Amanda was coming out of the shower. In that split second, I had a choice. Confront her immediately, unleash a torrent of accusations and anger, or simply wait and let the shock settle in, gathering strength and clarity. I could have screamed, let my anguish reverberate through the walls, but something inside me shifted. I decided that this was not the moment for a raw, uncontrolled reaction. Instead, I chose to step back into the shadows of the room, to hide my true feelings behind a calm mask, even as the storm raged inside me. As I listened to the steady beat of the water and the rhythmic sound of her footsteps approaching, I made a silent vow. I wouldn't let this betrayal define me or break me entirely. I would let it simmer, observe its edges, and plan my next steps carefully. In that silent, charged moment, I realized that sometimes the hardest part isn't the betrayal itself, but the choice of how to respond. And as Amanda's voice floated softly from the bathroom, unaware of the secrets I now held, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. That night marked the end of the life I thought I had and the beginning of an uncertain, tumultuous journey, one where every moment would be charged with the weight of betrayal, and every decision could lead to a revelation even more shocking than the one I had just uncovered. I remember the tension in the room the moment Amanda reached for her phone, her fingers trembling ever so slightly, as if they already sensed the weight of the conversation we were about to have. The air was heavy with unspoken questions and the knowledge that nothing could now be brushed aside. I looked her in the eye, the hurt and betrayal still fresh, and asked, "When exactly did the worksheet start to taste like another man?" For a split second, time seemed to slow. Amanda's eyes widened in shock before darting away, as if trying desperately to escape the reality she had created. Her initial silence was soon replaced by a rush of excuses and feigned indifference. She accused me of being inattentive, suggesting that perhaps I had misinterpreted harmless banter or that I was reading too much into a simple conversation. But every word on that screen, every message dripping with deception, left no room for such denial. As she scrambled for a justification, her tone shifted. No longer was she merely dodging the question. She was attempting to cast herself as the injured party. Amanda began to recount instances of my supposed neglect. How I was too absorbed in my work, too caught up in my own routines to notice any subtle changes in her behavior. With every word, she tried to paint me as the oblivious partner, as if her betrayal were merely the consequence of my inattention rather than a deliberate, calculated escape. I listened, feeling a mix of disbelief and mounting anger. The more she spoke, the more it became apparent that this wasn't a case of misunderstanding. It was a confession wrapped in layers of manipulation. The evidence was all there. The thousands of messages, the mocking tone, and the chilling indifference to the damage inflicted. Her attempts to turn the tables and portray herself as the victim fell flat. I already knew everything. Every carefully constructed lie, every half-truth she had fed me over the past year and a half, was now laid bare. In that charged moment, I saw her true nature, a person who had masterfully balanced the roles of lover and deceiver. The Amanda I thought I knew was rapidly disintegrating before my eyes, revealing a stranger who had used our shared life as a stage for her private performance of betrayal. And yet, there was an unexpected twist to her approach. It wasn't merely a desperate defense of her actions. It was as if she hoped to evoke my pity, to make me feel remorse for a woman cornered by her own mistakes. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, grappling with the raw sting of betrayal, while she tried to rewrite the narrative in her favor. Her voice, once warm and inviting, now quavered with an unconvincing mixture of regret and self-pity. It was clear that her strategy was to make me question my own shortcomings rather than face the betrayal head-on. But the truth was too evident. Her actions had not been a reaction to neglect or circumstance. They were the product of a willful decision, an escape from the monotony of a life that I had unwittingly enabled. As the silence that followed stretched interminably, I could feel the finality settling in. There was no room for compromise now, no path that could lead us back to the way things were. The trust that had once been the foundation of our life together was now nothing more than shards of a broken mirror. Every excuse she offered, every feeble attempt to justify her choices, only deepened the chasm between us. I realized that this confrontation wasn't just about uncovering the details of her infidelity. It was a turning point in our entire relationship. In that moment, with every lie exposed and every defense crumbling under the weight of truth, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The life I had thought I knew was irreversibly altered, and I was now standing at the precipice of a future filled with uncertainty and inevitable repercussions. Even as Amanda's voice trembled with contrived sorrow, I could no longer see her as the person I once loved. The facade was gone, replaced by the stark reality of betrayal and manipulation. And with that, the confrontation marked the end of any illusions I might have held about our marriage. It was the moment I realized that the path forward would be paved not with reconciliation or forgiveness, but with a quest for my own truth, a journey that would force both of us to confront the painful consequences of a trust betrayed. I stared at Amanda, my voice as cold as the winter wind when I said, "You have 90 minutes to pack your things and leave my house forever." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, a line drawn in the sand that could not be redrawn. For a moment, the room was still, the only sound the steady tick of the clock, counting down our final minutes together. Her face contorted with a mix of indignation and disbelief. I could see her trying to scramble for the perfect excuse, her eyes darting around as if searching for a lifeline in the maze of our shared history. "Mike, you don't understand," she began, her tone a cocktail of regret and desperation. "It was a mistake. I love you. I really do." The words tumbled out, desperate and unconvincing, as she leaned forward in a feigned posture of vulnerability. But I wasn't buying it. Each syllable she uttered reminded me of every moment, every lie, every betrayal that had eroded the foundation of our 15 years together. I fixed her with a steely gaze that conveyed everything she had lost in that time. "You threw away these 15 years, Amanda, and I'm just cleaning up this mess," I said flatly. The truth was simple and irrevocable. The love we once nurtured had been poisoned long ago by choices made in secret, and no amount of remorse could undo the damage. For a brief, painful second, Amanda's eyes flickered with something akin to desperation. Her voice wavered as she tried once more to manipulate the situation, to paint herself as the victim caught in the wrong circumstances. "You're the one who never noticed, who never cared enough," she insisted, her words piling up in a frantic rush. But I had heard it all before, the same tired refrain meant to distract from the undeniable betrayal. There was no room for her excuses now. Without warning, the tension exploded into action. In a fit of raw, unrestrained anger, Amanda began to gather her belongings with a force that suggested she was trying to outrun the inevitable collapse of our union. Every movement was sharp, fueled by a cocktail of fury and despair. I could almost hear the sound of our history shattering with every tossed piece of clothing, every slammed drawer. And then, as if compelled by the tumult of emotions that had boiled over, she lashed out physically. In a sudden, violent motion, her hand swung across the space between us, striking me squarely in the face. The impact was swift and stinging, a cruel punctuation to our final conversation. I staggered for a heartbeat, the shock mingling with the undeniable clarity that nothing could change the outcome. Her physical aggression was a desperate bid to reclaim some semblance of control, a last-ditch effort to flip the narrative, but it only solidified the chasm that now lay between us. I didn't retaliate. I didn't need to. The blow was a symptom of a much deeper wound, one that had been festering long before this fateful moment. Instead, I simply stood there, feeling the sting on my cheek and the cold certainty that this was truly the end. Every second of that painful 90-minute window was now etched into my memory, a period during which the life I had known dissolved into irreparable fragments. As she continued to pack her things with the ferocity of someone who felt cornered, every rustle of fabric and clatter of belongings was a reminder of the years that had slipped away. Each piece of her hurriedly collected baggage symbolized another promise broken, another moment of trust betrayed. Her attempts to humiliate me, to paint herself as the aggrieved party, fell flat against the stark reality of our shattered life together. The silence that followed was as heavy as a funeral dirge. I could hear the minutes ticking by, each one a silent verdict on what had been lost. In that silence, I wasn't overcome by vindictive satisfaction, but rather a profound, aching sorrow for everything that had once been. It was a sorrow not just for the betrayal, but for the loss of the shared dreams, the laughter, and even the mundane routines that had once given our life meaning. Yet, amid the sorrow, a spark of resolve ignited within me. The brutal clarity of that moment, the unvarnished truth of our crumbling past, pushed me to accept that I could no longer cling to what was. Amanda's rage, her attempts at manipulation, even her physical outburst, none of it could rewrite the history we had written together. I was left with nothing but the raw, unfiltered truth. Our marriage was over, and with it, the illusions that had once made us believe in forever. As I watched her, her back now turned and her belongings hastily stowed away, I couldn't help but feel an odd sense of finality. The person I once knew was gone, replaced by someone whose actions had irrevocably severed the bond we shared. In that moment, the decision was made, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I had to let her go, to free myself from the relentless grip of betrayal and regret. The 90 minutes were a countdown not just to her departure, but to the beginning of a painful, yet inevitable transformation. I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered by deceit, knowing that while the road ahead would be fraught with hardship, it was also a path toward reclaiming my own identity. The finality of her leaving was not the end of my story, but rather the start of a new chapter. One where I would have to redefine what trust, love, and self-worth truly meant. In that final confrontation, amid shattered dreams and spilled anger, I found a brutal kind of liberation. The act of expulsion was not just a moment of reclaiming my space. It was a declaration that I deserved better than a life built on lies. And as I stood there, feeling the sting of both physical and emotional wounds, I knew that no matter how much she tried to humiliate or manipulate me, I had already taken the first step toward a future that was entirely my own. Before she reached the door, as if compelled to deliver one final, venomous parting gift, Amanda paused and tossed out, "By the way, Derek was not the only one. There were others. You even know some." The words hung in the air, sharper than any earlier barb, a calculated attempt to twist the knife even as she made her escape. I felt a momentary shock, my mind racing back to familiar names and faces. Derek had always been one of those friends whose name carried nothing more than a friendly camaraderie, never suspicion. Now, that casual trust was being weaponized against me. The implication was undeniable. Someone from my inner circle, a person I'd once considered a confidant, might have shared in her betrayal. For a heartbeat, the possibility of treachery from within cut deeper than any other. But I quickly realized what she was really doing. This wasn't about revealing a hidden truth. It was about leaving me riddled with doubts and an endless well of pain. Her words were a final salvo meant to provoke and unsettle me, to make sure that even after her departure, every familiar face and every trusted name would be tainted by suspicion. I understood her plan. If I began to question everything, every conversation, every friendship, then her betrayal could continue to inflict damage long after she was gone. It was a twisted effort to cling to power over me, even in the aftermath of her own departure. I stood there, the silence of the room now as heavy as the secret it held, feeling a cocktail of bitterness, sorrow, and a grudging clarity. I could see clearly that her final act was less about remorse and more about manipulating the narrative of our shattered past. Every ounce of trust one once had was now under siege by the insinuation that not all the wounds came solely from her hands. For a long moment, I allowed myself to absorb the implications. Yes, the sting of betrayal was real, and the idea that someone I had known and trusted might be complicit added another layer to the pain. But I also recognized that giving in to her ploy would only perpetuate her control over my thoughts. Instead of allowing her to win by seeding doubt, I chose to let her words pass like a cold gust of wind through a long-abandoned corridor, unwelcome but ultimately powerless. The finality of her departure wasn't just physical. It marked the end of an era in which I had allowed the weight of her lies and manipulations to define me. With every minute that ticked away in that stark silence, I felt a hard, resolute determination building inside me. Her attempt to leave me questioning everything was, in truth, a feeble echo of the chaos she had willingly orchestrated. In that defining moment, I made a silent vow to reclaim my peace. I wouldn't allow her parting shot to dictate how I viewed every friend or every memory that once brought joy. Instead, I would sift through the debris of our shared history, holding on to only what was true and discarding the rest. I recognized that the more she tried to embed doubt into my heart, the more I needed to anchor myself in the certainty of my own worth and truth. Even as the door clicked shut behind her, closing the chapter on a life once shared, I understood that her final blow was a desperate attempt to poison the well of my future happiness. I was determined to rise above the twisted echoes of her betrayal. Though her words might occasionally resurface in moments of vulnerability, I now possessed the clarity to see them for what they were: hollow manipulations meant to inflict lingering pain. With a deep, steadying breath, I turned away from the remnants of our past, ready to forge a path forward that was mine alone. Her parting words would no longer haunt me. Instead, they would serve as a reminder of the strength it takes to let go of deceit and rebuild a life where trust, once again, could be a source of hope rather than perpetual doubt. Hours after Amanda stormed out and the silence of our shattered home began to settle into a dull, relentless ache, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. I was still reeling from the weight of her departure. Every minute since those explosive moments had dragged on in a haze of disbelief and seething sorrow. When I glanced at the screen, an unknown number was lighting up my display. With a mix of trepidation and a lingering hope for some kind of closure, I unlocked the device. The message read simply, "I wanted to tell you earlier, I'm sorry." My heart gave a brief, hesitant lurch. It took a moment for the fog of my thoughts to clear enough to register who might be reaching out to me. The name that soon surfaced on the screen wasn't one I expected, but the context made it unmistakably clear. It was Derek, one of Amanda's lovers. The shock of this revelation rippled through me. Here I was already drowning in betrayal, and now the web of deceit was expanding in ways I had never imagined. I reread his terse apology, trying to extract any hint of genuine regret or accountability. The words seemed to carry an undercurrent of resignation, as if he too had been caught in Amanda's carefully spun trap. According to him, he had no inkling that she was married when they began their affair. His message continued, explaining in halting confessions that he had been manipulated just as thoroughly as I had. Amanda, it appeared, had not only orchestrated her own escape from our failing marriage, but had also seduced others, drawing them into her orbit with the same calculated charm. The idea that Amanda could have spun such an intricate tapestry of lies, ensnaring not just me, but those within my own circle, was almost too bitter to swallow. My mind began to race through countless memories, subtle hints, offhand remarks, even the smallest inconsistencies that I had dismissed in the warmth of our shared routine. Was I the only one who had been so thoroughly deceived? The thought was both terrifying and, in a twisted way, oddly unifying. I wasn't alone in this. At least one other person had been victimized by her duplicity. Before I could fully process this confession, another message from the same unknown number blinked onto my screen. She already wrote to me. She wants to come to me. The word struck me like a second blow. This wasn't just about an illicit affair that had somehow remained hidden. Amanda was actively reaching out to him, possibly seeking comfort, validation, or even a fresh start. And Derek's message wasn't coming from a place of rivalry or malice. It was a reluctant admission of his own entanglement in her manipulative game. As I read, a cold, bitter realization seeped into every corner of my being. Amanda had not just betrayed me, she had methodically exploited the affections and trust of those around her. The juxtaposition of her calculated cruelty with Derek's candid, if reluctant, admission stirred a complex mix of emotions within me. There was the raw sting of betrayal, of course, an ache that was already all-consuming. But now there was also a dawning sense of clarity. Her final act of defamation, her attempt to leave me with doubts and suspicions about people I once trusted, was part of a larger pattern. She wasn't interested in sparing anyone from the fallout of her actions. She was determined to inflict as much pain as possible, to poison the well of my memories and relationships. I sat down, leaning against the cool kitchen counter, letting the shock of these messages wash over me. The timing of Derek's confession was peculiar, almost as if he had been waiting for the dust to settle before reaching out, uncertain of how much of the truth to reveal. His words, halting and apologetic, painted a picture of a woman who was not only a skilled manipulator, but also deeply selfish, thriving on the chaos she left in her wake. I felt a surge of conflicting impulses, anger that he had been ensnared by her web, resentment that he now seemed to share in my humiliation, and a strange, pained empathy for someone who, like me, had been deceived. In that quiet, oppressive moment, I contemplated reaching out to him. There was an undeniable part of me that wanted to understand the full extent of Amanda's treachery, to know if others had noticed the subtle signs, if Derek's experience could offer clues that might help me piece together the whole truth. Yet, I hesitated. The thought of delving deeper into this mess, of confronting another casualty of Amanda's duplicity, was daunting. My emotions were still raw, my trust in people fractured beyond repair. The idea of opening another door to more betrayal was as unappealing as it was inevitable. The messages from Derek echoed in my mind, each word a reminder of how deeply Amanda had infiltrated every facet of our lives. Even now, hours after she had slammed the door on our shared past, her influence lingered, an unwelcome shadow creeping into the corners of my consciousness. Her calculated parting shot was designed to leave me questioning the integrity of those I once held dear, to ensure that even as I tried to rebuild my life, I would be haunted by the ghosts of her manipulation. Yet, as I sat there, a quiet determination began to take root. I realized that while Amanda had succeeded in fracturing our lives, she had also unwittingly revealed the true extent of her treachery. Her confession, relayed through Derek's remorseful texts, was a final, damning twist in an already convoluted tale. It was a message that said, without ambiguity, that the betrayal was not an isolated incident, but part of a much broader pattern, a pattern I refused to let define my future. In that moment, I made a silent vow to myself. I would not allow Amanda's final act of cruelty to fester into a lifetime of doubt and mistrust. Yes, the wound was deep and the scars would remain, but I would rebuild, stronger, more discerning, and more resolute in my determination to seek out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Derek's confession, as damning as it was, became the catalyst for this newfound resolve. I would no longer be a passive recipient of her manipulations. I would confront the reality of her actions head-on. Even now, as the evening darkened into a cold, introspective night, I could feel the stirrings of a plan taking shape. A plan to reclaim what had been stolen from me. My sense of trust, my ability to believe in genuine connections, and most importantly, my own self-worth. Amanda's betrayal had cut me deeply, but it had also stripped away the illusions I had once held about the sanctity of our relationships. In its place, a stark, unvarnished truth remained, a truth I was now determined to own. The messages from an unknown number had brought with them an unexpected twist, a final piece of the puzzle that forced me to confront the full scope of Amanda's deception. And though the pain of betrayal still pulsed in my veins, it was joined by a simmering resolve to forge ahead, to rebuild a life where trust would not be given lightly, and where the lessons of this painful chapter would serve as the foundation for a stronger, more authentic future. With one last, deep breath, I set the phone aside. The messages would remain, a record of Amanda's final, spiteful attempts to poison my mind, but they would no longer control me. I was stepping away from the ruins of what once was, ready to embark on a journey of recovery, self-discovery, and perhaps, someday, forgiveness. For now, however, my focus was on reclaiming my truth and ensuring that no one, no matter how cunning or deceptive, could ever manipulate me into a state of perpetual doubt again. I'll admit, I never imagined that things would spiral to this point. But here I am, watching the final act of a tragedy that Amanda herself had scripted. After everything that had unfolded, Derek and I silently agreed that it was time for her to experience what defeat truly felt like. We didn't do it out of a desire for petty revenge, but to reclaim the dignity that she had so ruthlessly shattered. We planned meticulously, no grandstanding or theatrics, just a straightforward confrontation with the evidence she'd spent years covering up. Derek had invited her over to his place under the pretense of a casual meeting. In truth, he prepared a cold, clinical display of her transgressions. Every message, every whispered betrayal, meticulously printed out and arranged in plain view on his dining table. I recall the grim determination in Derek's eyes as he waited, both of us steeling ourselves for the inevitable storm. When Amanda arrived, she carried herself with a confidence that, in hindsight, was all the more revealing. But the moment her eyes fell on the table, the mask began to slip. Her hand trembled as she scanned the incriminating evidence. And then it happened, a furious eruption that shattered the fragile calm. "You shouldn't have found out," she shouted, her voice ricocheting off the walls of Derek's cramped apartment. It wasn't merely anger. It was the sound of a woman whose carefully constructed world was crashing down, piece by deceitful piece. For a brief moment, she tried to twist the situation, to manipulate the scene as she had done so often in the past. She pleaded, her tone shifting from indignation to a desperate attempt at justification. But Derek was unmoved. He looked at her squarely, his voice firm and resolute as he told her to leave. With a few decisive taps on his phone, he blocked her number, severing any possibility of further manipulation. The finality in his tone left no room for negotiation. As she stormed out of the apartment, I could almost feel the echo of every broken promise reverberating through the empty corridor. Outside, Amanda frantically tried to reach out, fingers flying over her phone in a desperate scramble to contact someone, anyone who might still be on her side. But the screen offered no solace. Every call went unanswered. Every message was met with silence. It was as though the world she had once dominated had collectively turned its back on her. I watched from afar as she realized, to her mounting horror, that her phone was nothing more than a lifeless instrument. Every friend, every ally, had blocked her. Standing under the indifferent glow of streetlights, Amanda's fury boiled over into a full-throated scream, a raw, anguished cry that spilled into the night and echoed down the street. Her voice, once so persuasive and calculated, now rang hollow with defeat. The neighbors, the familiar faces she once manipulated with ease, were now mere bystanders to her unraveling. In that moment, her reign of deception ended not with a bang, but with a scream, a public outburst of rage that left no doubt. She had lost everything. I sat in my car a little distance away, the engine humming quietly as I stared at the receding figure of the woman who had, for so long, been the center of my universe. I felt no triumph in that moment, only an overwhelming sense of finality and a bitter relief that the nightmare was over. The plan wasn't about causing more harm. It was about ensuring that the cycle of manipulation was broken, that Amanda's fabrications were exposed, not only to me, but to the world she once controlled. As I drove away into the night, leaving her behind amidst the echoes of her despair, I couldn't help but reflect on the paradox of it all. In trying to force her to confront the pain she had inflicted on so many, we had inadvertently set her free from the illusion of power she had clung to for years. Now, with every mile that passed between us, I felt a weight lifting, a step towards reclaiming a life marred by deceit and betrayal. The final downfall wasn't a moment of cathartic revenge. It was a turning point. I realized that while Amanda's actions had caused irreparable damage, they also taught me a harsh lesson about trust, vulnerability, and the fine line between love and self-destruction. In the wake of her collapse, I resolved to rebuild a life where my worth wasn't defined by the actions of a manipulative woman or the shadows of past betrayals. That night, as the city swallowed me into its quiet, indifferent sprawl, I vowed never to let the darkness of what had happened linger in my soul. Amanda's downfall was complete. She was now a ghost of the person she pretended to be, an echo of betrayal that had finally faded into silence. And with that, I drove onward, leaving behind a trail of broken lies and the promise of a future free from the tyranny of deceit. I sat in my car for a long while after everything had unraveled, letting the cool night air fill the space that had once been choked with the residue of deceit. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe without the weight of betrayal crushing me from all sides. The silence around me was profound, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days. And in that stillness, I began to feel a long-forgotten sense of freedom. Every painful moment, every tear shed over the ruins of our shared history, began to recede into a distant memory. The anger, the hurt, the overwhelming disappointment, they were all there, etched into the fabric of my being, but now they also coexisted with something else: relief. Relief that I had finally found the strength to confront the truth, to demand accountability, and to reclaim a piece of myself that had been buried beneath Amanda's endless lies. The realization hit me with an almost cathartic clarity. I was no longer a pawn in her manipulative game. I had taken control, and with that control came a clarity I hadn't known was possible. As I sat there, letting the steady rhythm of my heartbeat remind me that I was still here, I reflected on the past months. The confrontation, the expulsion, the bitter messages, and finally, the orchestrated downfall. Every twist and turn had been a brutal reminder of how deeply betrayal can cut, yet each had also forged in me a resilience I hadn't known existed. The scars, painful as they were now part of my story, a story that was finally turning a page. I glanced at my phone one last time before shutting it off, the screen still echoing with the finality of those exchanged words and the shattered remnants of Amanda's manipulation. In that quiet moment, I felt an overwhelming certainty that my life was moving forward, unburdened by the ghost of a woman who had lost everything worth fighting for. A soft smile began to form on my face as I whispered into the night, "The game is over, Amanda. You have lost." Those words were not a taunt, but a declaration of my liberation, a promise to myself that I would no longer be defined by someone else's deceit. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine coming to life with a steady purr, and drove away from the past, from the wreckage of broken trust and manipulated hearts. As the miles slipped by beneath the wheels of my car, the ache in my chest gradually transformed into hope. With every passing moment, I felt lighter, unshackled from the burden of memories that had once haunted every corner of my mind. I was finally free to rebuild, to rediscover who I was without the distortions of betrayal and regret. In that newfound freedom, I recognized the truth. Life was moving on, and so was I. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that happiness and peace were not just distant dreams, but tangible realities waiting just beyond the horizon. And with that belief firmly planted in my heart, I drove on into the night, into a future that was mine to shape, untainted by the shadows of a love that had lost its way.